LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, why aging is a superpower. I don't know how old you are. If I did, what would that tell me about you? If you're under a certain age, would I not take you seriously? If you're over a certain age, would I assume that you're obsolescent, a walking fax machine? I am 56 years old. To be honest with you, I'm not sure how to feel about that. I have been for most of my life unfazed by the aging process. Now I'm teetering on the brink of 57, which in turn is right next to 58, which is basically 60. That's an adjustment for me. 60 sounds old to me. And I see it. I see it in the graying hair, wrinkles, sunspots, and in the humility, the oddly calm acceptance I seem to have of my relative smallness in the cosmos. And yet, at the same time, I feel frisky, revved up, as energetic as I've ever felt. Like I have mountains to move, worlds to change, freak flags to fly. No matter how old you are, you're probably going through some version of this. A sense of periodic surprise at the passage of time, a recalibration, an acknowledgement of change, but maybe at the same time a defiance of it, a resistance to being pigeonholed. Our guest today, Chip Conley, describes this experience as age fluidity, the state of being all the ages you've ever been and will be at the same time. He sees it not as a state of confusion, but rather as a choice not to be limited by a set of outdated associations we have with chronological age. Chip points out that we are collectively in a process of redefining what midlife is. Rather than a word immediately followed by crisis, as it is in many of our minds, Chip sees it as a transition, sometimes challenging, to what, for many, is the most gratifying phase of our lives. Chip knows something about life transitions. He started a boutique hotel chain in his 20s, sold it in his 40s, then joined Airbnb in his 50s as their in-house modern elder. He went on to start the Modern Elder Academy, the world's first midlife wisdom school. Chip is the author of the new book, Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age, which our curator Dan Pink called a vital and necessary book, a roadmap for the rest of our lives. Such a privilege to have Chip Conley with us today.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
Chip Conley, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you. Great to be here with you, Rufus. I am honored, to be honest with you. I love the work that you guys are doing.
Well, thank you. Well, we're so delighted to have you here. Chip, I think I can say with confidence that you are aging right now. I'm aging. Everyone listening to us right now is aging. I see it, Chip, in the nooks and crannies of my body. I'm 56 years old. I see little bits of my father in these corners. I see spider veins in my ankles and old person freckles on my arms and hands, right? And I think most of us have some mixed feelings about this aging process. I think a lot of us are in denial. But you've gone on record as being pro-aging. You're in favor of this process. Why are you pro-aging?
So the reason I suggest that I'm pro-aging, and I said it on the TED stage last year and got quite an applause for it, which was interesting amongst all the biohackers at a TED conference.
Right.
The reason I think it resonates is because there are many playing fields upon which we live our lives. Mm-hmm. The one that you've pointed out at the start of the show is the physical one. And the physical
yeah.
playing field actually does get worse with age. A six-pack gets more expensive as you get older. And maintaining one, if you know what I mean, with time and energy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I don't know how to do it, actually, if you have ideas.
I never had one. So
yeah.
But long story short is there's not just the physical playing field, there's the emotional playing field. Our emotional intelligence gets better with age.
Yeah.
Spiritually, we get more curious. And some people say spiritual intelligence grows with age. Wisdom can grow with age. How we connect with other people can grow with age. And actually certain parts of our brain. Now, we know a lot of things that don't get better with age with the brain. Short-term memory, and we've seen our president, mess up a few words lately, as well as the leading candidate from the Republicans. So as we get older, certain parts of our brain get worse, but actually other parts get better. So crystallized intelligence, as Arthur Brooks quite popularized.
Yes.
And I think he was on your show.
He was. Yes, he was.
So there are a lot of things that get better with age, but society in general is going to convince you that almost everything gets worse with age, when in fact, the U-curve of happiness research shows that actually we get happier with age as well after a low point between about age 45 and 50 on average. Your mileage may vary.
Yes. I think you say in the book that young people on average overestimate how happy they'll be in 5 years. Older people on average underestimate how happy they'll be in 5 years.
That's true.
Right. So we have a problem with expectation management. And I think part of why you started the Modern Elder Academy, as I understand it, is that we need to get together and help each other through these periods, these kind of transitions in our lives.
Yeah. Do you mind if I talk a little bit about my story here?
Wonderful.
So I was a boutique hotelier, one of the first in the U.S. In my mid-20s, started a company called Joie de Vivre based in San Francisco. Created 52 boutique hotels over the next 24 years. I loved it till I hated it. In my late 40s, pretty much everything that could go wrong was going wrong. I did not know about the U-curve of happiness. I did not know I was right there at the worst time in life satisfaction for adults. But basically, each part of my life was sort of crumbling. And I got through it. I had an NDE. I died and went to the other side. And came back. Fortunately, paramedics brought me back with the paddles because I had an allergic reaction to an antibiotic.
Oh my gosh. How old were you at this
I was
time?
47. 47.
Wow. Okay.
During that time, I lost 5 male friends to suicide, ages 42 to 52. This is all during the Great Recession. And so I note to self, like, okay, this midlife thing, it sucks. Now I understand the old trope, the midlife crisis. And then I went into my 50s. I basically did what we at MEA, at the Modern Elder Academy, call the Great Midlife Edit. I really chose to edit a lot of things out of my life that weren't serving me very well. And some of them were mindsets. Some of them were internal mindsets and belief systems, but sometimes they're external as well. And I got into my 50s and like, whoa, I sold my boutique hotel company at the bottom of the Great Recession. It's now a Hyatt brand. And in my early 50s, I had some time and space for the first time in a long time. And I experienced what Mary Catherine Bateson, the academic, calls a midlife atrium, where I had the time and space to reflect upon what I wanted to do, how I wanted to consciously curate the rest of my life. And, out of the blue, and at age 52, I got a call from Brian Chesky, the co-founder and CEO of Airbnb. His first line to me on a cell phone call was, how would you like to help us democratize hospitality? And being a longtime hotelier, I was like, okay, well, that's a bold, first question. Who the heck are you? And I didn't know much about Airbnb at the time. This was over 11 years ago. And I joined, and, the rest is history. I was sort of like the person, the modern elder, as they called me, but I was like the in-house mentor to the founders. And I learned wow, I love my 50s. Didn't like my late 40s, my second half of my 40s, but I just loved my 50s on many, many levels. And that's when I started getting curious about midlife. Maybe midlife is not a crisis. Maybe it's a chrysalis. The magical metamorphosis of the caterpillar to the butterfly. The midlife for the butterfly is the chrysalis.
I love this. And
so in some ways, the way I look at it now, I mean, it's a very simplified version, but in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, we're like a caterpillar. We're consuming and producing. And then in midlife for the caterpillar, it goes into this dark and gooey time. Yes, it feels like a crisis, but it's actually where the magic and transformation happen.
And this can be a really dark part of the journey.
If we look at why is it that 45 to 50 on average is the hardest time of adulthood. There are a lot of reasons for it. Midlife is when you start to come face to face with mortality, maybe because of your parents, maybe because of friends or family members, maybe your own health diagnoses. That's one thing. During our 20s, 30s, and 40s, we've built up a bunch of expectations and hopes and dreams. And by our mid-40s, we can realize we're not going to become mayor of New York City, or we're not going to win a Pulitzer Prize, or we didn't marry our soulmate. So you sort of can see the future, and it isn't like you thought it was going to be. And so I could keep going, but I mean, the list is pretty long. And
it's a tough time. And can we dig a little deeper, Chip, into your experience? Because you were an overachiever, right? You were a very focused, driven, ambitious young man. You went to Stanford.
Yes.
You start this boutique hotel chain in your early 20s. You describe yourself as an admiration addict.
Yeah.
I'm interested to dig a little deeper into like what your young experience was like. I mean, I'm sure it's a time of your life that you really appreciate and have a lot of fond memories from, but also exhausting. And it landed you in this place of just being worn out, I guess.
We all have our personality types and archetypes of how we show up in the world. And I am the oldest and only son of two firstborn. And so I'm a firstborn.
Okay.
And
Me too.
And so there's a certain amount of responsibility that comes with that. And as the only son, and I'm Stephen Townsend Conley Jr., chip off the old block. So there's an element of like I was supposed to be a better version of my father.
Sure.
I grew up, learning that love and affection and attention came when I achieved. And, just as an aside, when I was 22 years old, I came out as a gay man. Now, doing that in 1983, when AIDS was on the cover of Newsweek, was not an easy thing to do. I did it living in New York, and lots of risks attached. And so I was that kid who had girlfriends in high school and college, was an all-American water polo player who was recruited to play at Stanford, was in a fraternity. So I didn't fit the normal profile of someone who's going to come out at age 22 back in that era. And so I think in many ways I wove into my persona and who I was and who I am this idea that I am only as lovable as my last achievement, and I live for admiration. And so I think one of the beauties of getting older is you can see your pattern recognition. You can see your shadow side. And I write a little bit about this in the book, that if I'm always trying to be admired, I'm just packaging myself. And I've got to be true to who I am. And of course, at age 22, when I came out, that was not easy for especially my father, who was a Marine captain in the reserves. And my process, though, I still have admiration addict built into me. But I have a sense of humor, and I can see it. I can see it a mile away when I'm doing it.
Yes.
And in the past, it was a shadow part of me that was showing up without me conscious of it. So that's a big part of like growing up, is to grow up and see yourself, be a first-class noticer of qualities about yourself that you want to improve and get better about.
Yeah. And when you say that you lost 5 friends to suicide in their 40s, I mean, that's kind of an astonishing number. Did they have similar paths to your own path? You were very successful, right? In your 20s and 30s, you were you were a star, right? You were building what I think became the second biggest boutique hotel chain in the country. So your life was on the surface close to perfect, or ideal or enviable. When you look back on it, how do you think about that kind of disconnect between your outward life and your inner life? And did you have how dark was that period for you?
It was very dark. So when I look at the 5 friends who took their own lives, and one of them was weirdly named Chip, my best friend in the world who had the same name I had. He was not my best friend, but he was the best friend who had my name. But he was still one of my maybe 10 or 15 closest friends. The variety of reasons why it was everything from entrepreneurs who had failures during the Great Recession and their sense of identity was way too attached to their business card, to one person who had long-term depression issues, another one who probably had some substance issues going on that was all under the cover and nobody knew about it. So that was what was going with all those. And all of the men. And men are 4 times more likely than women to do what they call successful suicide, which is such a terrible term. A successful suicide is actually dying in the process.
Right.
So men do it more often, and it's partly because men are so much less socialized to address vulnerabilities and what's going on in their lives. For me personally, because my life was just sort of crumbling around me, both in terms of my relationship. I have an African American foster son who was an adult at that point, who was, wrongfully going to prison. I was running a company I didn't want to run anymore and running out of cash, and long-term relationship ending. And so for me, I definitely had some suicide ideation, and literally was on my way to the bridge, to Golden Gate Bridge, to jump off, and had a conversation with my best friend Vanda, and Aretha Franklin came on the radio singing Amazing Grace while I was talking to her. It's like, okay,
Wow.
I get it. Thank you for the sign.
Gosh.
I'm not supposed to actually be jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. But I got to the other side of that through social support and love. And but what I took away from it was like, my God, we have no schools or tools or rites of passage or rituals in midlife. Adolescence is something we're very familiar with, although the word really only got popularized in 1904. We know that it's a liminal space between childhood and adulthood, and you're going through all kinds of transitions emotionally, physically, hormonally, identity-wise. And so we have all kinds of structures to help support people during that time. But midolescence, which is a word that describes the midlife transitions that are hormonal, emotional, physical, and identity, is a life stage that we aren't familiar with. Midolescence is a word that hasn't been popularized, and yet it's a time when we're going through a ton of transitions, but we do not have the peer group support in terms of the social infrastructure, nor do we even have a roadmap for people to understand what the heck they're going through. And so part of the reason that I created MEA was because I really wanted to help create the world's first midlife wisdom school, a place where people could have that midlife atrium, reflect upon what's next for themselves, and reframe your relationship with aging. Because as Becca Levy has shown at Yale, when a person actually shifts their mindset on aging from a negative to a positive, they gain 7.5 years of additional life. And so I wanted to be a living laboratory for her work.
I find it kind of fascinating that we have all this structure around children and school and counselors and sports programs and psychologists and all this, all this structure. And then you graduate from college and it's like, okay, all done. You're out of the oven. Now off you go. And we have some very effective institutions like AA for people who are recovering from addiction, or YPO for people who've built, wildly successful startups. But most people don't have these institutions in their lives.
And we used to have them a little bit. I mean,
yes, right. Church and Rotary clubs.
We had church and Rotary clubs, and the Robert Putnam, Bob Putnam's, bowling alone phenomena of just how the social infrastructure of our lives has eroded. And so, let's be clear though. Like in the 1950s, if you're in Rotary, you weren't necessarily talking about the things that were problematic in your life either. Everybody was sort of trying to look like they're keeping up with the Joneses. So, part of the reason I think, Rufus, that we haven't figured this out is because there are 3 life stages that emerged in the 20th century, and 2 of the 3 have gotten a ton of attention because they sort of got popularized earlier. So adolescence, we've talked about. Retirement was sort of a 1930s phenomena with Social Security, pensions, AARP, and retirement communities. And no doubt retirement and adolescence have gotten a lot of love. But we haven't made sense of midlife. And it was really the second half of the 20th century that midlife became a thing. But unfortunately, it got branded as this crisis. And then I think also when you think about adolescence and retirement and the ages of people who are young and people who are old, there's a sense that they need support and love and caring, and they're a little bit in need. Whereas someone at 50 years old who's crying about the fact that they are getting divorced and they lost their job and their kids aren't talking to them and their parents are in a nursing home. You don't want to hear that 50-year-old. You're just like, buck it up. You're an adult. Like, put your big pants on. And so what we end up with is a soaring midlife suicide rate, which is more than twice as high as it was in the year 2000.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's extraordinary. And it's, but the flip side, it seems to me, of this pain that so many of us experience in this kind of dark periods of midlife is that it turns out it's an opportunity for connection. I love this. Susan Cain has this wonderful line from Bittersweet: "Whatever pain you can't get rid of, make that your creative offering." And my kind of additional adjustment to that would be, make it your pathway to connection. The pain you can't get rid of, right? Because and I think this is what you've done with MEA, with Modern Elders Academy, right? It is to basically say, hey, let's come together. Let's help each other through this period. And this has been a powerful experience for you, hasn't it? I mean, this has been, it's been a form of service, but also a source of awe and connection.
Yeah. In many ways, I started MEA because of my 5 friends, especially Chip, because I wished that something like MEA had existed for them. So yes, it started 6 years ago. We've had over 4,000 people from 47 countries come to our Baja campus, which is an hour north of Cabo San Lucas on the Pacific Ocean. It's quite beautiful. And then we have a campus opening in Santa Fe, New Mexico, on a 2,600-acre regenerative horse ranch. And so we've had all these people. It's average age of the people who've come is about 55. It's about 60% women and about 40% men. People of all races and backgrounds, because about half of our people are on some kind of financial aid. So it's not just CEOs of tech companies or investment bankers, but it's social workers and physical therapists and firemen. So it's really interesting. You have about 24 people in a cohort for a week, and the level of depth of connection is beautiful. So it is my form of giving back. I did very, very well with my career, especially the Airbnb part of it. And I really wanted to bring to life in my life what Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist, said. And he said, "I am what survives me." And I really love that. So to do something that feels like, okay, this is going to survive me. My books, my school, the things I'm doing, the mentoring I do with all these folks, I love it. And I'm learning. I'm learning as much from them, the students who could join us, as they learn from me, because I am still a work in progress myself.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
You just mentioned the Airbnb period, which I think was such an interesting chapter of your life. And I think it was the young leaders of Airbnb who gave you the name Modern Elder, right?
They did.
Isn't that right?
Well,
which initially you didn't love, right?
And there's a lot of people who say, like, Chip, why did you ever name your school the Modern Elder Academy? Because a lot of people don't want to be elders, and because it sounds like elderly. But they said to me after I'd been there a few weeks, like, wow, Chip, I hired you for your knowledge. What you really brought was your wisdom. You're not just going to be mentoring us now and in charge of all of our hosts globally. You're in charge of strategy for the company because you are our modern elder. And I was like, oh, what are you talking about? Like, why are you making fun of my age? And they said, well,
I'm only 50. You were like 51.
I was 52. I was 52.
Which we know is a spring chicken, 52. I can tell you as a 56-year-old, that's a spring chicken.
It's, I still felt young enough, but the truth was the average age in the company was 26. So I was double the average age. And they said, Chip, you are a modern elder, but let me tell you what a modern elder is. It's someone who's as curious as they are wise. And when I heard that, I was like, okay, the alchemy of curiosity and wisdom, I can own that. And so yes, my time there was fascinating because what I realized pretty quickly was, wow, I better be curious because I'd never worked in a tech company before. I was 52 and surrounded by people half my age who knew a ton more than I did around technology. And so while I was, helping to run the company with the founders, I also needed to be the person in the room who was often the dumbest and hopefully asking great questions. So I often called myself a mentor, and an intern at the same time.
Oh, I like that. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was an intern when it came to DQ, digital intelligence.
Right.
But I was a mentor when it came to EQ, emotional intelligence, and a bunch of other things. And having the humility, especially after having run my own company for 24 years, all of a sudden I'm now in a company where I'm, double the age of everybody. The founders love me and they see me as a mentor, but I was also reporting to Brian Chesky, my mentee, who was 21 years younger than me. So how was that going to feel? And how does it feel to not be the person having my face on the cover of magazines? Because my job is to make Brian successful. So I had to right-size my ego in this process. And I also had to get used to the idea that humility and vulnerability is a powerful those are powerful character qualities.
Yes.
If you're showing up with some other things as well. If you're just vulnerable and you don't have a lot else to offer, then maybe it's not that helpful. But if you have other things to offer and you have a vulnerability to you, you're really a role model for others, especially the know-it-alls in tech companies, because quite frankly, it's very competitive. Everybody trying to be the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, right. And that's probably part of what that humility is probably a service to the culture and to the team dynamic. And we've learned that intergenerational teams, that age is a form of cognitive diversity, right? And we know that groups that are more cognitively diverse outperform groups that are less cognitively diverse, right? So it's, and there have been studies on this, right? A bit like a BMW and others, and Google, right? I mean, this is something that we should be doing more of this.
You know it. I mean, and BMW, Google, and there's a bunch of others. But basically, to describe it in a little bit more detail, as Arthur Brooks talked about in From Strength to Strength, you've got fluid intelligence when you're young, you've got a crystallized intelligence when you're older,
and maybe we should share what that means for those who don't know. Yeah,
fluid intelligence means you're fast and focused. You're really good at solving problems. You tend to do it pretty quickly, and because you're so focused, you can actually miss peripheral vision. And so when you're older, you get the peripheral vision. You have systemic and holistic thinking. You're able to connect the dots. To use a specific phrase from Dr. Gene Cohen in his book, The Aging Brain, you get four-wheel drive of your brain because your brain shrinks a little bit. And so you move from left brain to right brain more adeptly. You're able to see things, and so to have a team that is full of people who are both fast and focused, as well as more methodical and systemic and holistic, you get the best of both worlds on a team. And so age diversity is finally, after all these years, getting some attention in the DEI world as a metric that needs to be reviewed in companies and on teams. Is how do we look at age diversity?
So Chip, to what degree is midlife changing? We've had an extension of the human lifespan, and I think you say that historically we thought of midlife as 45 to 65. Now it's probably a broader range,
or even 40 to 60. Yeah, I mean, today some sociologists look at midlife as 35 to 75.
Wow.
So that's a long marathon.
Yeah. And why both earlier and later? The later side makes perfect sense because we're healthier, we're living longer, we're working longer. But why is it getting younger too?
The reason it's getting younger is because some of the qualities that used to feel like things that you felt in your 40s, feeling a little obsolescent, feeling maybe a little irrelevant, maybe getting disrupted in the workplace, are happening in people's 30s now. At MEA, while the average age is about 55, we've had people as young as 25 and as old as 88. Now, I think what's weird about that is like, why would a 25-year-old be coming into the Modern Elder Academy? Well, the reason that 1/6 of the people who come to MEA are either millennials or Gen Z is because they're really curious about wisdom. So in an economy that has been so knowledge focused, and now knowledge is commoditized through AI and Google, et cetera, learning how to cultivate and harvest your wisdom, which is one of the things we teach and help people with at MEA, is a quality that you want at any age. And so, yes, I think that people are realizing at an earlier age that they are in midlife, and also realizing that they need to figure out the tools to make it through midlife.
We had a guy named Mauro Guillen on the show who wrote a book called Periodicals.
Yes,
I don't know if you've seen that, right?
I have the book, yes.
Right, yeah, which I think would be very relevant for you. And it's all about building a post-generational society.
Yes.
And he makes the case that partly because of this combination of expanding lifespan, health span, as well as this incredibly transformative technological change that we're all experiencing, which is sort of disorienting and disruptive, and maybe why a 35-year-old today can feel like they're aging out. That really we should all be retooling every decade or two, going back to school, learning new skills. That rather than thinking of life as sort of a 3-chapter affair, that maybe it's 4, 5, 6, 7 chapters, right? That we should have cycles of re-educating ourselves and re-examining the world and reassessing like how we can be most useful and most engaged.
Yeah, it's a great book, and it sort of builds on a book that came out a few years ago called The 100-Year Life. And both these books talk about sort of the 3-stage life. You learn till you're 20 or 25, you earn till you're 60 or 65, and then you adjourn, you retire till you die. And that model, the tyranny of that model has been broken apart. So we should have more episodic lives. We should feel comfortable going back and getting a master's at 40, starting a business at 50, falling in love again and getting remarried at 60. So the idea that, we sort of grew up with the game of life, that board game that had one basic pathway through life. And you had your little plastic car, and you got extra plastic little points in your car once you got married and you had kids and you bought your first home and you got your first promotion at work. And it was like one path through life. And today, not only are there multiple paths, but there's also episodes so that you can actually, you should be able to go back and retrain or re-educate. The challenge is we haven't really set up society for this very well. And the idea of taking a midlife atrium or a sabbatical is hard. So I think the society has to start getting used to the idea that, wow, if there's college campuses that are actually going to, in the next 5 years, go away because colleges and universities are ready to be disrupted. They're, as Clay Christensen a few years ago said, like 50% of the colleges and universities in the United States are going to go away.
Wow.
Wouldn't it be interesting if you saw a beautiful liberal arts college in Western Massachusetts that actually got converted into a midlife gap year academy where people go and spend a year to reimagine and repurpose themselves. So it's, what we do, but for a year, and that they can actually save their funds to do that by taking 529 funds, which is tax advantage funds for usually for your college, kids' college education. You could apply that to yourself. So I think we almost need a GI Bill for midlifers to help them stay in the workplace longer. And guess what? If we do this the right way, we solve Social Security, because we have a Social Security issue of, people are living longer, but we haven't really changed retirement ages all that much. And we need to do that. I mean, no politician wants to say it because it's the third rail and the AARP is going to be all after you. But the fact is, helping people to have a midlife pit stop where they get refueled with new education, new thinking, new perspective. That's a beautiful thing because it might mean that people stay in the workplace into their mid-70s instead of their early 60s.
I want to go back to college, Chip. I don't know about you. I definitely do a semester or two. And Dan Pink has this great line that in his book about regret, he talks about how the number one regret is not having done a foreign exchange program or a semester abroad. And so he was pitching somebody should start a semester abroad. So, we could do this in Copenhagen or Florence or it would be great. But no, I see this in our future. And of course, part of the analysis is recognizing that most people actually have more lifespan in front of them than they think, you say in the book. And I think this is how you open your MEA 5-day experiences, right? Is to do the math and realize that actually most people have misread the longevity data, which says average American male lives to 76, but actually we have more time than that, right?
Yeah. So if you're a 65-year-old and you see that the average man in the U.S. lives to 76, you think, oh my God, I've got less than a dozen years left. But the truth is, just because you got to 65, it means you probably have a pretty good chance of getting to 85. So we have a pretty poor longevity literacy. And meaning if we don't really understand how much longer we might live, we don't save properly, we don't take care of our body properly, and we may sort of start just, hanging out as a couch potato because the average American retiree watches 47 hours of TV a week.
That's such an astonishing data point. It's really depressing. I mean, there's some good programming out there, but not that much good programming.
No, definitely not. So I think helping people to understand that, wow, you've got a lot more life ahead of you. The average age of people at MEA is 54 to 55. If the average age they think they're going to live till is 90. Most of us don't realize that 54 is exactly halfway between 18 and 90. So at 54, you have as many adult years ahead of you as you have behind you. And you can think back to being 18 as like, wow, that's a lot of life. But most people don't think that way. And this is why, I think this question of that we like to ask at MEA around speaking of regret, what is it that you wish you'd learned or done 10 years ago that you know now or have done now? And then more importantly, 10 years from now, what will you regret if you don't learn it or do it now? It's a really important question. When I was 57, I asked that question of myself. I'm 63 now, and it's part of the reason why I started surfing and I started learning Spanish, living on a beach in Mexico, because it was going to be harder 10 years from now at 67 than at 57.
And this lifespan math, and thank you for sharing that. That does put a bounce in my step. Was you say that when people underestimate their lifespans, they're less optimistic about the future and less open to trying new things. One of my favorite details in your book is you describe this counterclockwise study done by Ellen Langer in 1981 at Harvard, who created a, quote, living time capsule. Do you want to share this? It's so cool.
She took a bunch of people in their 70s and mostly in their 70s and some 80s, I think, and she retrofitted a home out in the country such that everything in the home was sort of a time capsule to the past, whether it was Elvis Presley music or it was sports memorabilia on the wall from a different era, etc. And for a week, she had these, seniors living in this home that had all of that nostalgia. And what happened was, because they sort of went back to an era in which they were younger, the study basically found that the psychology of aging was that if you can help people to feel youthful again, you can actually help them to live longer.
Yeah, you write in the book, a week later, these participants had dramatic improvements in their hearing, memory, dexterity, appetite, and
Yes.
well-being. So and it shows how much of this is psychological. So how do you think of yourself? This is also related to the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves matter profoundly, don't they?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about midlife is it's like if you are reading a novel, a quarter of the way through the novel, you're not exactly sure all the characters and where it's going, but halfway through the novel, you've got it. You understand where it's going. And that's sort of like halfway through life. By halfway through life, you can have enough pattern recognition of who you are and how you've shown up, and you've built some recognition and wisdom about yourself that understanding your narrative, understanding who you are and how you are, allows you to have a better sense of the through line of where you're going. That is one of the gifts of midlife, is to be able to have enough years behind you to understand, what you've learned along the way. I like to say that your painful life lessons are the raw material for your future wisdom. So the longer you've been on the planet, the more raw material you have. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that as a 70-year-old, you're wiser than a 30-year-old, because you may have had those life lessons, but you didn't metabolize it or digest it in such a way to understand, what you learned along the way. So the key there is to say, how do we help people metabolize their wisdom? Something I've been doing since age 28, so for 35 years. So when I was 28, I'd been running my boutique hotel company for 2 years. I was a complete imbecile. I was running a boutique hotel company, but had no background in hotels. But my first hotel got off to a good start. We ultimately had 52 hotels, but this first one got off to a good start. And then we had the Loma Prieta earthquake, which happened in the Bay Area, and the Bay Bridge almost, part of it fell down. And so no one was coming to the Bay Area for, 6 months. And I had one hotel and it was empty. And so I limped into the weekend one weekend thinking like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I ended up taking a journal off the wall or off the bookshelf, and I hadn't written in it. And I wrote on the cover of it, my wisdom book. And I started a practice that I would recommend people consider. And it's also valuable for leadership teams. Every weekend, I would make a list of some bullet points of what I'd learned that week, personally or professionally, partly with the intention of just trying to understand what my life lesson has been. Because again, if your life lessons are raw material for future wisdom, being conscious and intentional about it's helpful. But what if you were to do that with a leadership team? And I've done this at Joie de Vivre, at Airbnb, and at MEA, where once a quarter I sit down with our leadership team in a normal weekly session, maybe an hour or 2-hour session, and every person on the team, 8 or 10 of us, comes together and says, like, here was my biggest lesson of the quarter. And here's how it's going to serve me in the future. Wisdom is not taught, it's shared. And so the fact that my director of operations is talking about something he learned in his career, I can take advantage of that. I can learn from him. So long story short is I am a big believer in the fact we're moving into the wisdom economy, because we've been in the knowledge economy for 60 or 70 years. And it was Peter Drucker in 1959 who said the future of the workplace is going to be owned by knowledge workers. And he was right. And knowledge management as a practice became a thing. And I believe that wisdom management practices are going to become a thing. And I just think wisdom is such an important and scarce quality, or something that we need to be focused on. So
let's talk about age fluidity. I love this phrase, Chip. I think this is your phrase. What does it mean to be age fluid?
So to be age fluid means that you are not defined by a chronological age or generation. You're all the ages you've ever been or will ever be. And you see chronological age as almost like a costume that you can don or take off whenever you want. A 30-year-old could say, I'm age fluid. I'm an old soul. And sometimes I feel like I'm 50 or 60 years old. And that's perfectly fine.
Sure.
So age fluid can be applied to anybody. And yes, I like the term. And yes, when I first actually started talking about it, I went to the Google and Googled it, and I found that, oh my gosh, to be age fluid means you're a pedophile. That was like, okay. And I was like,
that's not what
I mean. And so I'm trying to popularize the term, and because most people don't know the fact that
Let's take the term back. Let's take the term back for the pedophiles. Sorry, guys, we're going to take this one. This is and do you feel age fluid?
I feel so age fluid. When I was at Airbnb, Rufus, I felt very age fluid because yes, I was older, but also people then found out like, oh, Chip was a founding member of the Burning Man nonprofit and has been going to Burning Man for 25 years. Or Chip started a rock and roll hotel and knows a lot of musicians. And so in some ways, people had a hard time categorizing me because and I think that's frankly what, if you're curious and wise, if you're that modern elder quality, that is the difference between a modern elder and a traditional elder. The traditional elder of the past had reverence. The modern elder has relevance. And so to be relevant means you actually understand the context in which you can actually offer your curiosity or your wisdom. But it's the reverence piece that, leads to the okay boomer perspective, which is like, okay, boomer, you're telling me how the world works. Your war stories are not necessarily our wisdom. And thank you. And I don't need to listen to you anymore.
Totally. Yeah. No, I this really resonates for me because I feel both very young and also old in different ways, right? I feel young in the sense of being excitable and curious and kind of revved up, right? Like I'm still, I really don't feel, I'm 56. I don't feel much of a dissipation of energy or anything, but I feel old in the sense of being kind of humble and unafraid, and humble before the finiteness of time, before the universe, like prudently cautious. Like I don't need to jump off cliffs when I'm skiing.
Yes.
Like I like respect the body. Like I feel sort of uncategorizable in this sense of age. And I think age fluidity to me really resonates. And I think it's exciting to know, for younger people to know and older people that we can be at once frisky young in our behavior and also sort of thoughtful and reflective and humble. And actually, to me, Chip, this notion that I think the best discovery for me in my second half of my life, I guess, in midlife, is realizing that you can become more confident and more humble at the same time. And in fact, humility is on some level these two things grow together.
I'm in New Mexico right now in Santa Fe because we're opening our campus here. And I sometimes say being in New Mexico, which is, almost like not being in the United States, it's an unusual place. I say that I believe in my HP here, and I don't necessarily mean just higher power. I mean humility and patience. And when you show up, especially if you're older, with humility and patience, you're more present, and it's also sometimes a surprise to people, especially in a culture where there's a reverence for elders. So listen, I love Richard Rohr is on our faculty, famous Christian mystic based here in New Mexico. He says, you know what we all need is a humiliation a day. Just not serious, just not a serious humiliation.
Right. Yeah. One area in which I feel somewhat conflicted about my aging process, like as much as I have been sort of grateful for the aging process, I will admit, Chip, that the idea of like 56, teetering on the brink of 57, I'm staring down 60. The idea of being 60 is an adjustment for me mentally. Like it's right, like in terms of how I think of myself, right? Because that's not like 50 was an adjustment. The prior decades didn't really bother me at all.
Right.
But it is a reframing of how we think about ourselves. And one change I notice in myself is I'm less focused on trying to take over the world, like trying to be on the cover of magazines.
Yeah.
I remain really interested in building things, right? And building things hopefully at scale, but very much in a partnership with other people, helping people build things.
Yeah.
Mission focus. But I occasionally catch myself saying in my inside voice, well, if this or that doesn't work out, no big deal. There's 7 other things I'm passionate about. And then I think, wait a second, Rufus, that's the complacency of age. That's not okay. Don't lose the ferocious tenacity of youth, right?
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit kind of torn on this topic of like, of how my relationship with ambition in this phase of my life. How do you think about that?
As someone was ambitious when I was young and still ambitious when I'm older.
Yeah.
The ambitious takes on a different flavor.
Yeah.
And I would say a couple of things. Number one is Richard Rohr, who I mentioned earlier, as well as Carl Jung, both say the same thing, which is the primary operating system of our life in the first half of our life is our ego. And it's what individuates us and propels us forward, helps us to understand who we are in the world. And then it's around midlife that we have a primary operating system change. We move from the ego to the soul, but nobody gave us any operating instructions for this change, nor a warning that it was coming. And so what's going on for a lot of people, they can feel something inside of them, a curiosity, a connection to something bigger than themselves, and maybe a lessening of the ego. I had to learn that my timing with going to Airbnb was perfect for this because I had to right size the ego by the fact that I was no longer the sage on the stage. I was the guide on the side. I was not going to get, nearly the kind of attention I was getting when I was the founder and CEO of my own company. So the bottom line is that is something psychologically that's going on and maybe even spiritually. So that's one thing. Secondly, if we live a beautiful life and we have a collection of other things in our lives, we start to realize that no one thing is going to sink us, and we stop sweating the small stuff as much. It is, when you're a 14-year-old and your best friend breaks up with you, you feel like your life's going to end, or you just sort of you get traumatized by it, and you have a lot of exclamation points, a lot of exaggeration, hyperbole. When you get older, you've seen your life and you've seen the ups and the downs, and you weather the storm better. It's not, the U curve of happiness, sometimes people say like, well, that doesn't make sense, Chip. U curve of happiness doesn't make sense because, frankly, people go through a lot more bad circumstances after 50. Yes, but you actually learn how to metabolize it and that you're going to get through it, and you don't catastrophize everything like you did when you were younger.
Midlife needs a rebrand. Like whoever the publicist is for we got to fire and rehire, right? Basically getting an AARP card in the mail at age 50 is very few people are delighted to receive that card in the mail, right? Despite how lovely the duffel bag is that you get with your subscription. So do we need to? I imagine there's space for a number of different new kinds of institutions, new kinds of societal organizations, changes to how our companies operate. How do you see the evolution from a society-wide perspective of becoming wiser as a society and supporting all of us through these transitions?
Well, we need to create more intergenerational collaboration on all levels, politically, career-wise, in the workplace. So that's one thing. And I'll start with just companies. Companies need to be using metrics at looking at age within their companies. They look at how do you elevate stories of people across generations who are solving really vexing problems for the company. How do we create mentorship, mutual mentorship programs such that someone older who understands how to run a great meeting can teach a younger person that, while the younger person can teach the older person how to use their iPhone or all of the utility opportunities in their iPhone that they don't even know exists. So how do we create mutual mentorship matching in companies or in society?
That's great.
How do we help to elevate the idea of people saving not for their retirement and saving not necessarily, they can do that too and save for their kids' education, but save for their own midlife education. How do we help make that become sort of a basic premise? How do we help people to see what gets better with age? And then how do we know if that is true? For example, if wisdom is a really valuable quality, how do we create wisdom management practices like the one I mentioned earlier with the wisdom journal in such a way that people actually are getting wiser? Because wisdom is different than being savvy or smart. Being savvy or smart can be metabolizing your life lessons for your own selfish benefit. And that's great. Nothing wrong with that. But wisdom is a social good. And so when wisdom, as someone who's wise is different than someone who's smart or savvy. And so when we actually elevate wisdom as a society and help more people become wise, we're actually helping society as a whole. And so that's part of the reason why I think midlife wisdom schools like MEA, being the first in the world, are going to become a bigger deal. We're going to see more of these in the next few decades.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think, Chip, about the wisdom afforded by the deathbed perspective? I used to force myself to sort of like once a year go through an exercise of saying like, okay, Rufus, you've got 12 months to live, 18 months to live, 24 months to live. What are you going to do? And when I ran that experiment, I found that, well, if it was only 12 or 18 months, I'd quit my job, spend time with my favorite people, and do a lot of writing and reading and be very focused on sort of people and the arts. But I love my work, right? And so I don't want to quit my job. So I found that if I extended that out to 5 to 10 years, I would start getting better answers, right, about that were more useful, about how to integrate some of the things that were most important to me in my life. How do you think about sort of how critical? I mean, arguably, the deathbed perspective is what makes us wiser as we get older. That we're conscious of this finiteness.
Yeah, and it's called memento mori in Stoic times, and it's the idea of understanding mortality or death as an organizing principle for life, as Steve Jobs once said. And what I think is valuable from a social research perspective, just know that Laura Carstensen at Stanford Center on Longevity has studied this, and she's shown that when people have a shorter amount of time left, they get less focused on the future, more focused on the present moment, what matters, and in so doing, by focusing on the present moment and what matters, they actually are happier. So weirdly, having less time ahead of you makes you more happy today. So much of it comes down to how you reprioritize your life. For me, I have stage 3 prostate cancer, and I found that out. I found out I had stage 1 5.5 years ago. Then it went to stage 2 3 years ago, and now it went to stage 3. And so in 2023, I was doing, hormone depletion therapy. So I only had 1% of my normal testosterone. I had my prostate taken out. I had 36 radiation sessions. So it was a tough year. And so coming face to face with my mortality and thinking of cancer as a teacher, not as a gladiator, not as somebody I'm going to get in the ring with and kill, but more like, okay, cancer, what are you going to teach me? Helped me to see like what were my priorities. And I have sons who are 12 and 9 with a lesbian couple who are good friends. And it's like, I want to spend more time with the boys. And so that became a thing. I want to have more time to focus on things outside of my career. I want to spend more time with my parents. So sometimes, as Viktor Frankl talked about in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, of being in a concentration camp in World War II, despair equals suffering minus meaning. Suffering's sort of an ever-present. It's always going to be there.
I love that.
But despair and meaning are inversely proportional. And I wrote about this in my book, Emotional Equations, and the idea that, like, okay, when you're going through a really tough time, you have to look for the meaning and the hope, because if you can do that, you can get through the worst of times. So I just think that's a key lesson when it comes to mortality.
Yeah. And how's your health now? How are you doing?
Well, I'm back on the hormone depletion after having been off it for a month, which was sort of a bummer. So here's my story, Rufus. I finished on January 12th my last radiation session, and doing them daily for almost 2 months, and so for 5 days a week, and then I got on a plane the next day, and I was on my way to New York because 2 days later, I was on the Good Morning America show. The next day, my book came out. The next day, I was on the Today Show. And 2 days later, I was with your wife at her the Swell event, Sex Symposium event.
Sex Symposium.
Speaking at it. So, I mean, luckily, I have the energy. But what a complicated time. But the good news is I've had a lot of time to reflect on, again, cancer as a teacher, and how do I set myself up such that if cancer got worse for me, what will survive me? And, one of the things is my books and MEA, and of course the influence I've had on others, including my sons.
Well, Chip Conley, thank you so much for being with us today. Such a wonderful conversation.
An honor, Rufus. Thank you.
Chip Conley's new book, Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age, is out now. If you'd like to learn more about the Modern Elder Academy, go to meawisdom.com. You heard Chip reference my wife, Elisa's company, The Swell. I'd like to take this opportunity to give my wife a little shout out. The Swell is a growing community for women 40 plus that is reimagining how we age. They host events across the country and soon around the world, and they're building an online learning platform. To learn more, go to theswell.com. What did you think of this episode? What do you think of this show in general? We'd love to hear from you. Record your thoughts in a voice memo and send it to podcast@nextbigideaclub.com. If you're one of the first 3 people we hear from, we'll give you a free digital membership to the Next Big Idea Club. With that, you'll be able to listen to this show ad-free, hear hundreds of nonfiction book summaries written and read by the authors themselves, and you can enjoy exclusive content from our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Susan Cain, Adam Grant, and Daniel Pink. Today's episode was produced and edited by Caleb Bissinger. Sound designed by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.